So apparently I've got Strange World on the brain. Um, this video is going to be about me talking, well, a little bit about like Disney's history with like science fiction, like some of the other science fiction things that they've attempted, but also just kind of like how they've handled different animation variations of science fiction in regards to some of the movie similarities that I've seen between Strange World and some of the other Disney projects that they've done over the years, some of which I've talked about in previous videos. Several of these videos I reviewed in when I was going through and reviewing all of the different animated movies, um, and just kind of that comparison. So, um, to start off with, Disney has not that Walt didn't have some interest in science fiction. He had a little bit of an interest in it. Some of the kind of the first one that I could find that was like Disney's first attempt at like, science fiction, fantasy type of a thing, to a degree, was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which came out in 1954. I think I've talked about this a little bit in a previous video. Obviously, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is, of course, the movie that's based off of the book by Jules Verne and such, that I believe he also did Journey to the Center of the Earth and several other ones, of course. But that was kind of Disney's first attempt at science fiction, and it was a live action movie, so it's not an animated one. Although seeing what they could have done with animation in that regard would have been interesting, but no, it was live action. Have not seen it. I'm pretty sure it's on Disney Plus, so I may end up trying to find it on Disney Plus and watch it at some point in time, just because I've never seen it, and I kind of like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, that regard and everything with Captain Nemo and the Nautilus and everything. So I might look into watching that at some point in time. But as far as I could tell, I think that one ended up being a fairly good one for them to do, and it ended up being, I think, a good hit. And then several years later, well, actually about 20 years later, they did The Island at the Top of the World, which is another science fiction one that they did in 1974. I don't know that much about this one. I've never heard of it. I've at least heard of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But this one I'm not exceedingly aware of. I don't know if it's based off of a book by anyone. I tried looking that up. I don't think I found if it was based off of a book. If I missed it and it is based off of the books, please comment about that in the comment section. But it's just not something that I've heard of before. From the poster that I saw, it definitely looks science fiction-esque. So again, it's a live action one that they did. And again, it might be something that I decide to look up and possibly watch if it's on Disney Plus. A few years after that, they did a movie that was called The Black Hole, which I've heard this one talked about before because I think it was Don Hahn, who's also done a lot of other Disney animation stuff, that he was involved in The Black Hole, but I don't know anything about it. It's another science fiction one. There's a robot in it that I think looks like Robbie the Robot from Lost in Space, so I don't know that much about it. Again, moving on. And then they had in 1982, they had Tron, which I would say Tron did pretty good in regards to how it was, accepted by the public and stuff like that. I have seen Tron and Tron Legacy. I've seen both of them a couple of years ago. I don't remember if it was quite during the pandemic or whatnot, but a couple of years ago, my dad and I were just kind of like, well, these are some other movies that we've never actually watched before, so let's watch them. So we did Tron and Tron Legacy. We also did Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure 2, or whatever the second one was, and then the most recent one, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure 3, or whatever it was. Just because it's just like, I've never seen these, and I kind of want to see them. So we did that. So there's Tron and there's Tron Legacy and such that are like this kind of like other attempt at like science fiction setup. And then in 1991, they also had a movie that was called The Rocketeer. Now, I think this is, from what I saw, it was based off of a book from like the 1930s. Again, I have not seen it. The poster looks kind of cool, so maybe there's the chance I'll end up watching it at some point in time. Doesn't mean I'll end up doing a video on it, but maybe I'll end up watching it at some point in time, along with, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and a couple of other ones. just to see it for the purposes of like, oh yeah, I've seen that. It's insert whatever adjective I decide to use for that. Good, okay, excellent, eh. Don't know, so I'm not going to judge it. And those are kind of their history with like live action stuff. Now, clearly over the last decade and such, Disney has been they've bought Marvel, and they've Marvel Studios, and they've got Star Wars, and they've got Avatar, and all that stuff. So it's not like they're a stranger to science fiction in those regards, but in those cases it was the company buying up other companies that were or franchises that were already well established in those regards, because with Marvel and everything, there's all of the comics, and they already had Marvel Studios, and then Disney bought them up and everything around the time that they did the first Avengers movie, because that's kind of where they got the capital to be able to do that. And then I'd say that that's paid off pretty well for Marvel and Disney, and that good partnership. And then you've got the Star Wars and everything, and while the third trilogy, it brought a whole lot of new fans into things, and I enjoyed the movies. I can see why other people have issues with them, and I'm not going to deny that. But yeah, there's that. But they've gotten all of the different TV series out of it and everything that I'd say have probably definitely helped with keeping the franchise alive. And kind of bringing some of those other ones back to the surface in regards to that. And then of course with Avatar, we just had Avatar: Way of Water come out, which I haven't seen. It's not something that's on the top of my list to go see in theaters. I'm like, no. I'm sure it's gorgeous in theaters, and particularly if you saw it in 3D, but 3D for that amount of time just gives me a headache, unfortunately. But I'll probably end up watching Way of the Water at some point when it goes to Disney Plus, whenever that is. And watch the behind the scenes things for it, because I like those things. But then we get into more of the animation setup that Disney has tried to do when it comes to science fiction. Now, I'm quite sure that throughout all the history of, Mickey and his gang, that there's been some different attempts at science fiction with them, where it's just like a short, not like a feature-length movie or anything like that, but like shorts where they've done like, oh, Mickey and the crew have to deal with like science fiction type stuff or something like that. Like, oh, there's a rocket and they have to go back in time or something like that, or they go to the future or whatever. I'm sure they've done that at some point in time. I don't know what they would have done, but I'm sure that's happened. DuckTales would kind of be a good way of putting that, because DuckTales have definitely dealt with those types of science fiction type things and fantasy. Particularly the new season that they did, the new series that they did. But in regards to the animated movies that Disney has done, that have been science fiction, unfortunately, those have not been quite as well received. And unfortunately, Strange World is kind of the longest in a long history of that, going back a little over 2 decades, in all honesty. Now, some of these videos I've talked about before, as I've said, or these movies I've talked about before. I actually talked about 2 of them very recently when I talked about comparing them to some of the different things that have happened in One Piece. But they are, of course, Atlantis: The Lost Empire, which came out in 2001, and then Treasure Planet, which came out in 2002. And then I'm also throwing in Meet the Robinsons here, because that was in like the mid 2000s, mid to late 2000s. There were several Disney movies that came out, that and Home on the Range and Chicken Little, both of which I have seen Home on the Range. It's been a very long time, and I think I've only watched it like twice, and I don't care for it. And I've never seen Chicken Little. But Meet the Robinsons and like Bolt was in there as well. Those were some of the movies that kind of like, carried Disney through. I think Meet the Robinsons and Bolt were 2 of the better movies that came out in that time frame, and I talked about that when I reviewed those movies. If you want more of my full opinions on those movies, go watch those videos. But some of the other things is in that time frame, the thing is that both Atlantis: The Lost Empire and Treasure Planet ended up being like these, I wouldn't say like a cult hits or something like that, like the way that I was trying to, well, Tron to a degree, but the way that I was trying to think of an example that would go with that. the way that like uh Rocky Horror Picture Show is. It's like they're not as like an occult classic. They're still really, really good, and they've gotten like like a second life breathed into them at times. In regards to that, Atlantis had the sequel movie that had been intended to be a series that they were working on, but they just scrapped the series idea and used what they had and turned it into a movie, which I was okay with. Would have preferred a series more, but they went with the movie, and I'm like, okay, I'll take that. And then Treasure Planet never really got anything. I think there may have been a video game that went along with either Treasure Planet or Atlantis: The Lost Empire. I think I remember hearing something about when I was doing research for some of the Kingdom Hearts videos I did, where I was talking about other worlds that they could do in Kingdom Hearts. I think I had the thought that it was like, I thought I read something or saw something that they had been in development of like an Atlantis: The Lost Empire section in the game. And that just, it didn't come to fruition, unfortunately, which I think would have been fun. And, Treasure Planet version of Kingdom Hearts World would have been amazing. Meet the Robinsons would have been interesting. Meet the Robinsons isn't quite as in the same vein because it's, it is kind of a coming of age story as well. But with Atlantis and with Treasure Planet and with Strange World, there is kind of this very big family dynamic that comes into it. But that's also in, Meet the Robinsons. So there is a fair amount of comparison there. And even if you just compare like if you watch Meet the Robinsons and then watch Strange World, which has 15 years between them, there is you can see the animation upgrade in that time frame, which says nothing about the animation in Meet the Robinsons, because I think it's very good animation. But when you go into Strange World, and I know that a lot of people haven't really had a whole lot of complaints about like the animation style in the movie. They think the animation style is beautiful and very well done, and the way that they've designed the world is very, very well done. I've heard a fair amount of compliments in that regard. The main thing that happens unfortunately with Strange World, and unfortunately this happened with Atlantis: The Lost Empire and Treasure Planet, is that it is kind of this more original take on a story. Whereas if you have like the fairy tales, you go to your Cinderella, your Snow White, your Sleeping Beauty, all of your stuff from the Disney Renaissance and everything. There's most of the stuff from the Disney Renaissance, there's a fair amount of like, human memory with that stuff, because we have all these fairy tales that we grow up on. Yes, Treasure Planet is based off of Treasure Island. I think that's also written by Robert Louis Stevenson. If I'm blanking on that one, I think that's correct. If I am wrong on that, I'm sorry. But no, it's Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Duh. But whereas Meet the Robinsons and Strange World and even Treasure Planet or even Atlantis, those aren't really like in our zeitgeist. Those aren't really something that's like part of our, cultural heritage as much. I mean, like, people have heard about Atlantis. That's why it's been a legend for so long, but it's not as prevalent of like, oh yes, let's go watch this movie. It's like, is it a musical? Well, no. Is there a princess in it? Well, yes, but she's like a warrior princess. Okay. That archetype got much better used later on when we got, like Merida, and when we got Raya. Yes, I know Raya is technically not a Disney princess, but she kind of falls in that same vein. The same thing with like Moana, where we get like the princesses down the line that are much more independent. And Kida was one of the first cases of a princess that is like raised as a princess, and then at the end of the movie she's the queen. We saw this with Elsa later on with Frozen, and then Anna in Frozen 2. So there is a difference there. There's kind of that same kind of legacy that goes with that. I'd also technically say Nala, but like Nala is not raised as a princess in The Lion King. She does end up being queen because she marries Simba, but she's not raised 100% to be a princess. So not quite the same thing, but you get where I'm coming from. But then when you get into Strange World, there's a fair amount of comparison there. But there's also some different takes on it. Searcher feels like he's been abandoned by his father in Atlantis. Milo's grandfather was dead at that point in time, but it's not like he abandoned him. And when it comes to Treasure Planet, Jim, Hawkins' dad definitely abandoned him and his mother. He just straight up left and never came back. And then in, Meet the Robinsons, the kid's abandoned. He's left at an orphanage. Lewis is left at an orphanage, and nothing to say against people who have to leave their child at an orphanage because it feels like that would give them a better life. I understand that, but we kind of see that with Lewis, is he just wants his family. With Strange World, yes, Searcher does have his son. He has Ethan and he has Meridian, and they have a very good home family life. But there's still that pressure that, of course, Searcher wants Ethan to follow in his footsteps the same way that Yeager wanted Searcher to follow in his footsteps. And I know that one of the criticisms that people have had with the movie is that it tends to harp on the, this very strained father-son dynamic that happens between, Yeager and then Searcher, and then Ethan. And the fact that, it still results in shouting matches from both of them in regards to, like, having to deal with their issues. And there's a whole lot of other stuff that happens with that in regards to emotional constipation that happens, because we can't just have them have, like, a decent conversation and fix this. I'm going to be doing a little bit more of a character study on Yeager in one of my next videos, and comparing them to a certain character in One Piece in that regard. But for some of the other things that happens with Strange World is that clearly it is obviously this big adventure movie. Disney has done adventure movies before. A lot of the more recent ones have actually involved going on some type of an adventure. Moana involves Moana having to leave her island. Raya has to travel across Kumandra. Different things like that. And Kanto is still technically an adventure, but it takes place just within, their little home area. But it's still an adventure that that Mirabel has to go on and such. And of course, as I stated in the review for Strange World, Ethan basically blatantly points out there are no bad guys in this movie. Yeager's not the bad guy. Callisto's not the bad guy. Searcher's not the bad guy. Ethan's not the bad guy. Technically, the enemy is the Pando. And it's like them having to figure out how to work with all of the different antibody creatures in regards to destroy the Pando, because the Pando is what's hurting hurting the giant animal that they now figured out that they live on the back of. Which has callbacks to other things. A good example would be in comparison to the Droon that are in Raya and the Last Dragon, where it's the Droon are actually the ones that are the, this manifestation of the enemy, but it's still all of this different prejudice and stuff like that, and this different hesitation that, like, Raya and the other groups have to work together. And eventually, by the end of it, the way that they defeat the Droon is, of course, by working together and putting their trust in each other and actually being able to do that. So there's that comparison there. I was going to say Treasure Planet is kind of like, there's not necessarily 100% a villain in Treasure Planet. There is Silver, who is kind of like the antagonist in it, and he is an antagonist when that gets revealed a good way through the movie, partway through the movie, that he's kind of the bad guy. Also, the weird Mr. Scroop, or whatever his name, that's the weird spider psycho, as he's referred to as, he is technically also kind of like a villain in the movie as well, considering he's one that actually ends up killing the, vice captain or whatever his name is. And then getting, Jim blamed for it. But, at the end, Silver does end up actually helping. So there's that. But, and then, like, with Atlantis, The Lost Empire, yes, the villain is straight up Rourke, which is not revealed until partway into the movie, when they kind of, see Atlantis and stuff. And then we get that hint that Rourke is the bad guy, and then he is straight up the bad guy with everything that happens with, taking Kida and, shooting the king and everything. But, and again, Meet the Robinsons did have a straight up villain. It was a bowler hat that was a mechanical, weird robot bowler hat that ended up being obsessive and angry because it got shut off. And that's the villain in the movie, but it's still a villain. Whereas, yes, with Strange World, that villain, that concept of like, oh, there is a straight up villain that is like the evil witch or the evil queen or this sorceress or this pirate or this weird vizier that has a parrot, or, whatever else you want to go with, that is this physical manifestation of something that is evil, that is a sentient form of something that is evil. Technically, the pando is not a sentient thing. It is a plant that is doing what it's supposed to do. But that's causing problems. And I went over that in Strange World itself. But one other thing I did want to make a comparison to in this regard, and I haven't really talked about Pixar that much, because Pixar has also done its take on different types of adventure movies. Up is a very good example of this adventure movie. By a technicality, some of the Toy Story movies kind of turn into adventure movies, and the fact that the toys end up getting separated from Andy or Bonnie, and then they have to go on an adventure in order to find their way back to them. One way or another, Brave has like that adventure quality to it. There's a few other ones that have like this big adventure quality to it. That have to go and traverse this new land, or this land that they're not exceedingly familiar with. But I'm actually going to aim for a Pixar short. And that is the Pixar short La Luna, which came out in 2011. I really like this Pixar short. When my dad and I were watching through all of the different Pixar movies, I do believe we did watch through a bunch of the different Pixar shorts as well. And I know that on Disney Plus they have like the Sparks shorts, which are also like they're the same vein of like the Pixar shorts, where it's just like, these are other, directors and artists that they're kind of like testing the waters with and seeing how they do with these smaller projects. And then sometimes those ones end up going on to doing the bigger projects. Like, for example, the lady that directed Turning Red also was the one that had directed the short Bow, which I mentioned when I talked about Turning Red, and that she was that director there. And then because of how well that did, that's kind of one of the reasons that led to her being able to direct Turning Red. Turning Red, another one that technically does not necessarily have a straight up villain in it. The villain, as what happens in Encanto, as what happens in this, is this, family trauma, generational trauma that they've dealt with, which I'm kind of okay with Disney doing that, but I do also think that occasionally they do need to throw in the movies where it's like, no, there's just this straight up villain thing that we have to deal with. It's actually like a person that's evil and we have to stop them. You can still give the villain a complicated backstory, that's fine, but you get where I'm coming from. But the comparison that I wanted to make to La Luna, and for anyone that's not exceedingly familiar with La Luna, first go watch it, it's adorable. It is this little boy and his dad and his grandpa, and we see them in this boat, and then we see them waiting, and then we see this moon rise up. And then we see them basically, rope the moon and ladder up the moon and like climb up to the moon and get on the moon. And while they're there, we find out that the moon is covered in all of these different like star pieces, and it is their job to like sweep the star pieces into like whatever phase of the moon it's in at that point in time. And I love that concept. It's adorable. But it's also, again, just like with Strange World, it is this thing of there is a father, there is a son, and there is a grandfather. And there are these different intergenerational relationships that we see, because in the short, we see very easily that, it's, the father does things this way, the grandfather does things this way, and it's the little grandson, I cannot remember his name, I'm sorry, I think it's like Bambino or something like that, that is, has to try to figure out his own way. And we see this curiosity in his eyes because this is his first time being there, whereas for the dad and the grandpa, it's like, they've done this countless times where they go and like, sweep the stars on the moon to get it into the correct shape. And it's Bambino's first time on the moon. And which is just like this whole, like, that whole concept in and of itself is just like, this is apparently a family job that these ones do. Do the wives and the moms ever get to come? Does Bambino have a sister that's going to get to do this one day? I do not know. These are questions I need answered. But we see this comparison where it's just like, the grandfather wants Bambino to do things his way, father wants Bambino to do things his way, and Bambino just wants to find his way. Pretty much the same thing that happens in Strange World, where Searcher is worried that Ethan is going to turn out like his dad, like Ethan's grandfather, like Jaeger, and you know, Ethan is just trying to figure out how to do things his own way. He loves his dad, and yes, he does love farming Panda with his dad and helping with that, but that's not necessarily something 100% what he wants to do with the rest of his life. I mean, at the beginning of the movie, when we're introduced to Ethan, I'm sure he'd be happy with that. You know, if he gets Diageo there and his friends helping him and everything like that, he'd be fine. But then, of course, this whole thing happens, and we see that he is, you know, does have like the explorer set up in him that he wants to explore, but he also wants to find a way to work with nature as opposed to against it. And I mean, like, technically to a degree, like, Searcher has found a way to work with nature in regards to using the Pando and stuff like that, whereas Jaeger is like flamethrower everything because I don't know what it is. And with La Luna, we see very clearly that at one point in time there's this giant star that lands on the moon, and both the dad and the grandpa are just like, oh, we have to figure out how to get this. I hear the dog. We see the dad and the grandpa just both trying to figure out like how to just like get this thing out of the way because it's annoying them. And Bambino, just like this curious little kid that he is, he just like climbs up the star, which is another thing that I love saying. Climbs up the star, and he like I guess finds like the right, you know, spot on the star to like hit with his hammer, and then it shatters into all of these other star pieces. And we see in the video, in the short, we see like the grandfather and the dad's eyes, like, because they've just been like covered most of the time, like, you know, big bushy brows or a hat or something like that that's been covering their eyes, and we see their eyes open and just how wide-eyed and amazed they are at what they just saw happen, because it's like doing this is like something that they do every day, whereas with Bambino, this is his first time, and he found this different way of getting around the problem. They were just trying to move the star. He just finds a way to, like, you know, help the star break apart into all of its pieces, and then they can sweep them. And, you know, it's like the grandpa has like this type of a broom, and the dad has this type of a broom, and Bambino actually ends up using like a rake instead of a broom, which is just adorable. But I wanted to point that out. I thought that was kind of an interesting comparison, that like out of all these other Disney movies that have happened where, yes, there's these science fiction stuff and these adventures and, you know, this, you know, science fiction adventure thing that has like, you know, parental issues and family issues that happen in it, that one of the closest things I could come up with that is a very summed up version of a very similar thing between Strange World and something else that Disney has done is a Pixar short about a little boy and his dad and his grandpa that are in charge of sweeping the moon. I just thought that was adorable because I'm like sitting there watching, you know, watching Strange World, and I'm noticing the other comparisons too, of just like, oh, those animals are like the, you know, antibody, you know, the, you know, antibody system and white blood cells and everything like that are inside of all of us and everything that help keep us safe and like all this other stuff. And I'm just like, this intergenerational thing seems very familiar. Why does it seem familiar? And then I'm like, La Luna. That's what it is. It's La Luna. That's why it sounds so familiar. Which I love La Luna. It's definitely, I think, one of my favorite Pixar shorts because it's just so adorable. So, that's what I had for this one. Yes, it's like, how much can she ramble about a Disney product? Test her. Just give her something and see what happens. But yeah, that's what I have. I thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day. Bye.